This killer's story begins in 1987. David Heiss was born on June the 19th to a Bolivian mother and a German father in Frankfurt, West Germany. He was the eldest of 2 children.
Affluent, he had quite a leafy suburban upbringing, but he was unhappy.
Heiss's childhood is quite a turbulent one. So his parents separated when he was 6, and his mother went on to remarry.
After his parents divorced, it was decided that Heiss would live with his grandparents near Limburg an der Lahn.
And he was effectively brought up by his grandmother and grandfather, to whom he was close.
I think he feels like he's the outcast. And when you have those interruptions, those disruptions in the attachment that somebody has with their parents, their primary caregivers, that starts to have an impact on the relationships that they have with other people.
Heiss's mother remarried and went on to have more children.
I think here we've got an individual who feels like he never really sort of fits in. His mother's formed a new family unit, so I think there's always that feeling of being an outsider, of being awkward, of not having a sense of belonging in the family.
His mother, a nurse, still lived in the town, but he barely spoke to her, and his father was even more distant from him.
As a result, Heiss became insular and isolated.
Heiss is put out to pastures. And the message in there to the child is very simple. Love can't be counted. The closest thing to you can just set you aside and go on to a new life as if it's nothing. This creates a desperate sense of insecurity.
I think very early on in those early years, we're starting to see the seeds sown for a disruptive adulthood, for somebody who's going to have difficulties with relationships, but it becomes an awful lot worse than that.
Estranged from his parents, Heiss also struggled to make friends.
He was an isolated child. He took refuge, as so many adolescents do now, in the net, in his bedroom, his computer.
The teen would spend up to 8 hours a day on the internet and developed a passion for online gaming. His social interaction was limited to other gamers.
Here's somebody who doesn't have great relationships with his peers, so he seeks solace online. He makes friendships with people in the virtual world, and the virtual world is very different from the real one because you've got a lack of social cues. You've got that lack of kind of eye contact, of seeing a person face to face. And I think this is something that actually suited him down to the ground.
At school, Heiss excelled academically, but he couldn't afford to go to university.
It was a fact that rankled him. I think he felt from a very early age, that's what I was due. I want to be at a university. He was clearly clever enough, but it wasn't possible.
Aged 19, he decided to join the military, but after just 2 weeks he was discharged for not being mentally suitable. Instead, Heiss took up an apprenticeship at a textile dye production company.
And in itself, that, coupled with his extraordinarily isolated childhood, turned him into an introverted, unhappy, complicated boy who had never come to terms with any kind of relationship.
And things would only get worse for the troubled teen when his grandfather died in 2007. At approximately 1 a.m., David Heiss made his way to Joanna and Matthew's flat.
We've got images of him putting his bag down, walking up the road, hiding his bag, coming back, spending a lot of time just thinking what he was going to do.
He doesn't knock on the door. He sleeps outside the flat, beside an air conditioning unit, which was presumably giving out some heat. It's not the depths of winter, but it still was cold.
Joanna and Matthew had no idea that Heiss was back in the country and just meters away from them.
When Joanna got up in the morning in order to go to work, she kissed Matthew goodbye and she walked out.
And he specifically waits for Joanna to go out to work in the morning. He watches her leave. He's now decided that the only way he can have her is if he kills her boyfriend, Matthew.
With Joanna now out of sight, Heiss made his way up to their flat.
He's got gardening gloves with him. He's got a weapon with him. This is premeditated. This is planned. This is something that he intends to do. It is very execution-like in style.
Heiss then knocked on the door.
The moment that Matthew opens the door, David Heiss launches himself at him, stabbing him repeatedly. And indeed, stabbing him relentlessly with the knife that he's brought specifically for the purpose.
In a cruel and frenzied attack, Heiss chased Matthew around the small flat.
Matthew had gone into the fetal position behind the closed door and then managed to escape and go running down the corridor and into the lounge. You could see evidence of where he had banged into items such as doors or cupboards, and where the blood was smeared. And then he was pursued, across into the corner of his bedroom come lounge.
David Heiss had viciously stabbed Matthew a total of 86 times.
So this is something that is way more than you need to do to end a person's life. He didn't just want to kill Matthew, he wanted to completely obliterate him and have complete control. He was very incensed that this barrier was in the way to getting the thing that he wanted, which was the relationship with Joanna. So killing him wasn't enough.
To stab somebody 86 times actually takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort. It tells you that somebody really, really means to cause that person very serious harm. We would normally describe this sort of murder as a sustained assault. This is not a moment of madness. This is planned, it's calculated.
It's just an explosion of cathartic rage. He has been between him and his true love from the day that they met.
Despite his horrific injuries, Matthew managed to leave a clue to his killer at the scene of the crime.
To Matthew's eternal credit, he managed, in his last moments, to write the first 3 letters of David Heiss's name in his own blood on his computer console. He wrote D-A-V, presumably hoping that someone would recognize what that meant and lead the police to David Heiss.
In one sense, the fact that he was still conscious enough, still willing enough to try and identify his assailant, to write the first 3 letters of his name on a monitor, shows how strong he was. But at the same time, it tells us that he was conscious, he knew what he was doing throughout the whole of that attack.
Tragically, Matthew died from his horrific injuries. Heiss had thought he'd committed the perfect murder, but he was now the police's main suspect. They just needed to find him. The police were now looking into the killer's background.
Well, we started to make some investigations around Heiss and where he was from. The only thing that we'd got from some of the gamers was that he maybe lived near Frankfurt, and we didn't have any other information.
After talking to other gamers, the police discovered that Heiss was apparently online the morning that Matthew was murdered.
We had managed to convince his sister that he was going away overnight to a party and that he needed somebody to manage his online account, and then got his sister to log on to the computer. We were really concerned about that. Had we got this right?
Even though he'd killed Matthew, Heiss continued to act innocent to the other gamers.
When he was back in Germany, he began to say, "How is Matthew? And has anybody heard from Matthew?" Well, Matthew was dead.
However, the police were still convinced that Heiss was their main suspect. But since he was an online gamer, they had no idea where to find him. Then there was a breakthrough in the case. Information came through about the car crash that Heiss was involved in back in August.
The fact that the police had attended that crash, and what had happened was that some items had been sent to Heiss from the car by the AAA. It's like the European version of the recovery service in the UK. And that gave us a couple of addresses that linked to Heiss. So we were then able to go to the courts in the UK. We give them enough information that suggests we should arrest this individual.
With a European arrest warrant, the police went through Europol and made contact with the German authorities. Ufa Quimbach and Rashid Barouch were assigned to the case.
After receiving a formal request, we carried out the background checks. The only thing we knew was that he was a young man that lived in the district of Limburg-Walburg. He didn't show up in any police records, so we found nothing. It was a total blank slate for us.
Heiss, unaware that he was being investigated, decided to send Joanna a message on Facebook 4 days after he'd murdered her boyfriend.
He wrote a note which said, "I'm sorry for causing you so much trouble. I hope you won't lose all your hope. We will be there for you." That gives you an indication of the distortion of Heiss's mind. We will be there for you? No, I think what he really meant was, I will be there for you. What he really hoped is that Joanna would fall into his arms, that she'd somehow be won over by the fact that he'd eliminated her boyfriend.
This is a very clumsy attempt at trying to worm his way back into her affections. And this really does, again, show his complete lack of judgment, his complete lack of awareness of social norms, of ways to behave when somebody has died.
It reflects a complete inability to see the world from the perspective of the victim.
Meanwhile, the German authorities now had an address for Heiss, and on the 24th of September, he was finally arrested.